Okay, so first thing, this meeting is being recorded. And if you don't want to be on a recorded meeting, then you should leave. Though you're probably not going to be talking, so maybe nobody should care. Hello, I'm Joe Armstrong. This is the Power Systems Virtual User Group webinar. And for January, Happy New Year, everybody. I hope 2022 actually turns out a little better than 2021. It's starting out to be pretty much the same. But hopefully we take an uptick this year and kind of get past this whole pandemic thing and get more onto the way life was before. But I wish you a happy new year, a good, prosperous new year, and good health. And a few things about the webinar today. The presentation materials are out on the wiki. I put the wiki site and all the stuff I send out. So if you've gotten anything from me, you should have a link to the wiki site in there. If you don't have it, put something in the Q&A and I'll stick the link in there. I'll put a replay out there after I get it downloaded and formatted and uploaded and everything like that. So I'll put a link to the replay out on the wiki. Two things. One is there's a Q&A panel and a chat panel. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A panel. That'll be the panel that we kind of look for questions. If you want to chat away in the chat panel, that's fine. But if you have questions for Jackie or I during the presentation, go ahead and put them in the Q&A panel. And with that, let's go ahead and get to our presentation. Today we've got Jackie Lynch with us. I first met Jackie probably at one of the Tech U's or places where she was speaking. And one of the three great things about Jackie is that she is so willing to share her information. She is not an IBMer, although she has more than 40 years of experience working in platforms within IBM. Mainframes, Unix systems, mid-range personal workstations as well, so not just all bigger systems. She worked primarily on Unix in '93, and since 1999 has been really focused on power systems. Jackie was an IBM customer for over 22 years, and she's worked for different business partners, and right now she's an independent consultant. She focuses on enterprise architecture, virtualization, performance, security, a lot of other stuff. I know Jackie's been around the block a few times and speaks at not just IBM conferences and virtually these days, but also I see her in other conferences and stuff as well. So she's really out there and, like I said, sharing a lot of information with us. Today, Jackie's going to talk about VIOS, VIOS top tips, and I have to tell you, probably VIOS and performance are the two topics that I get the most requests for the Power Systems VUG, and so it's great to have her talk about VIOS here. And so with that, Jackie, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Joe, and thanks everybody for attending. I just let Joe know that I sent him a new copy of the handout because I found a couple of typos. So you might want to wait till tomorrow to download the handout or the copy that I have linked to here. So this presentation is a little different to my usual VIO one. And Joe, I can't see the questions because of how I'm sharing my screen. So if there's something that comes up, if you could let me know.
Sure will.
So this presentation is more, rather than an installation, an upgrade, etc. It's about top 10 tips, only it ended up being like 12 of them. And we're just going to step through some of the things that I think you would find it very useful to know and recall if you're running VIO servers. And I've been using the VIO server since, I want to say version 1.5. And I'm currently at the latest. So the top 10 tips I have, and we're going to go through each one individually, are things you would have seen if you'd seen any of my other VIO server presentations. Things like staying current through resources and updates. And we will go through those. I also have a link to an article on using NIM with VIO servers. And I just had an article published in Tech Channel, which I forgot to put the link in here, but it's basically on updating AIX and HMCs. So if you go to the Tech Channel website, you'll find a lot of articles by me, by Rob McNally, and a number of other people on topics related to power systems. So one of the things I like to talk about is patch order. If you're going to stay current, you need to have an order that you do patches. I always read all the READMEs, and then I typically will do the HMC. If I can, I'll do the server firmware. Sometimes that gets done last simply because they won't give me the window. I always keep my NIM server at the very latest level. All my NIM servers right now are already at AIX 7.3. And I try to make my NIM server stand alone with its own network card and its own fiber card. That way I can use it to restore VIO servers, which I can't do if it's dependent on them. Then I'll patch VIO servers and any associated IO firmware, and then I'll do my LPARs. Now, that order might change if the READMEs say something else, like the HMC might say the server firmware has to be at a certain minimum level. Typically what you see is the server firmware says the HMC has to be at a different level, but that's why it's important to read them for all the updates you plan to do. And I don't just document everything. I actually write up what I think every step of my update's going to be before I do it. And then I tweak it as I go along. So for my HMC updates, I already have all the get upgrade files and etc. commands in a document that I plan to use. So that kind of leads into staying current. So PowerVM 3.13 came out on September 10th last year, and its primary thing was to provide the support for Power 10. It also made a change. If you've ever done LPM, if you forgot to remove your virtual optical devices, your LPM wouldn't work. That now is no longer an issue. And it also makes some changes to the mover services petitions. There's a bunch of other things that it brought with it. Those are the three primary ones that I found. But 3.13 only runs on Power 7 Plus and higher. And if you have any Power 7s or 7 Pluses, you should be looking to replace them anyway, because the latest HMC version, version 10, does not support any flavor of Power 7. So just a heads up on that. So in terms of staying current, a lot of people don't realize that most of the versions of the HMC, of the VIO server, are out of support. So this key here is all the versions of VIO server. So you see, I've only listed 2.2.6.65. That went out of support on September 30, 2020. If you follow this through, pretty much everything prior to 3.11.10 is already out of support. And come November this year, everything prior to 3.12 will be out of support. So if you're at any of those levels, you should be thinking about going to version 3.13.14. And that's pretty much where I'm taking all my VIO servers right now. That also means that you will have the latest security patches, etc., installed as well. This is just the document that they publish on the VIO service life, and it pretty much backs up what the previous slide said. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do your installs. If you're doing a fresh install, I always tell people to go to ESS, which is the IBM Untitled software site, and download the .iso images from there. The nice thing is you can download the two images, which used to be two different DVDs, or now they have one that's called a flash copy, which is the one that you burn to a USB stick, but you can actually install from that image. And so that's the image I download because it's one image. And it also means when I'm doing a version 3 upgrade, I can use that image and it has one makesysb file in. Because if you're using NIM to do the upgrade, or if you're doing a version 2 to version 3 upgrade, you're going to be using the makesysb that's in that ISO. If you use the 2 DVD copy, there are 3 makesysb images that you have to concatenate. If you use the flash copy, there's just one. So keep that in mind. I always just download the flash copy now. And I have in here the links to the release notes for 3.1.3.1.4. And just be aware that your NIM master needs to be at least 7.2.5.3 if you want to use NIM to back up and restore your VIO servers. And like I said, I've just updated all of mine to version 7.3 of AIX anyway. Anytime you're installing a new server, make sure you download the latest copy of the Red Book for that server and go through, I think it's Chapter 2 operating system levels, and double check what the minimum VIO and AIX and IBMI, etc. levels are for that server. That way you won't get a rude shock when you try to boot the LPAR and it won't boot.
Jackie?
Yes?
Somebody asked why it's not recommended to update to 3.13.14, only to 3.13.10 first. And you mentioned that. Why it's not recommended to go to 3.13.14 only, except for to go to 3.13.10 first?
You know, so that's on that stay current slide, right, where it has them. So I've actually
asked
IBM,
I think on your previous slide there.
Yeah. So I've asked IBM about that a couple of times because it's like, well, this is a slide. And what they tell me is that the recommended upgrade is what engineering was recommending as a minimum at that time. So,
okay.
So it's fine to go to 3.13.14. It's been out since December, but it is very stable. I don't know why. I think 3.13.10 is the first 3.13 that came out. Service pack time. So I have get 3. I don't know why they didn't update it sooner.
Okay, and one other question then. Can you make, and this has to do with your NIM server that you mentioned, can you make the LPP source and spot on the NIM server from the Flash ISO?
Yes. Well, okay, hang on. Let me rephrase that. You do not make an LPP source for a VIO server. What you do is you make a spot from the makesysb image that you extract from the ISO image. And in the update presentations that I do, I explain that to people. So you actually build just a spot. You never ever have an LPP for a VIO server.
Okay, and somebody else put a question in, but I think they're really just helping to answer the question. They say the VIOS mini pack update release of 3.1.3.1.14 may only be applied directly to any VIOS that is at level 3.1.3.10.
So IBM offers 2 different things. There's a service pack and a mini pack. The service pack lets you update, and I think I've got something on this a little bit later, but the service pack lets you update from 3.1.0, I believe. I'd have to go check the README. And the mini packs are normally just from like a base level like 3.1.3.10. So I never bother with the mini packs. I always just download the service pack. But sometimes, you know, you don't have a service pack for the latest. You have to use a mini pack. But a mini pack's always just a very small update.
Okay.
All right. There's a bunch of links here to things like the fixed level recommendation tool, VIO server to NIM master mapping, and so on. And these are just in here as things that you may find useful to look at. But I use FLIRT extensively, and I also tend to look at the VIO server hypertables and security tables. In fact, as part of my IBM account, I have them email me whenever there's a security patch for VIO servers. So let's talk about putting on hypers and other fixes. Part of keeping current involves putting on patches to the operating system, whether it's service packs, mini packs, Ifixes, Ifixes, but also your VIO server has Java, SSH, and SSL. And I would say 80% of the security fixes that come my way are for Java, SSH, and SSL. So SSH and SSL get downloaded from the web download pack, and I have the link in there for it. It appears to get moved regularly. So if that link stops working, just Google IBM web download pack. And you pretty much untar the files, and I put all my SSH, SSL, and Java files into one directory. And then I use update iOS to update it. I do not use SMIDI to put patches on my VIO servers. I always use the update iOS command. The one exception is Ifixes and Ifixes, which we'll get to. So when I do this, this will actually update all my Java SSH and SSL to the latest levels. Why do I do this separately? Because all the service packs and mini packs, they just don't stay up to date with the new patches that come out for Java SSH and SSL. So I basically make sure that I do. I always check that on 3.1.3 it expects you to have not just the Java 8 SDK, but the Java 8_64.SDK. Now, once you're at 3.1.0, you can get rid of Java 6 and you can get rid of Java 7. You only need Java 8 on your VIO. And just as a point of reference, the very latest levels of Java 7 and 8 both end with .700. So it'll be like 8.0.0.700. If you're at a level less than that, you have security holes on your VIO server. The latest SSH is 8.1.0.2104, I believe. So just so that you have that info. Now, Ifixes and Ifixes, this is what IBM brings out when they have patches to some of the third-party stuff, or when there is a patch that there is not a permanent fix for yet. So sometimes you'll see if you run FlirtVC, which is IBM's fixed level recommendation tool vulnerability checker, you'll see something like you need to put in bind fix 17.tar, and then you'll see that it's fixed in, and it will give you the service pack and technology level that it's going to be fixed in. But if that's not out and it's a major security hole, then you're going to want to use eManager to put the patch on. And typically before you do any kind of upgrade to the operating system, you will need to remove those patches. So basically I run eManager-L and eManager-P to see what's installed. And then I'll download it from IBM and untar it. And then I will run eManager to install that patch. And at this point, there's no level of the VIO server, including 3.1.3.14, that does not have at least one security hole if you have no patches on. So you should be getting familiar with FlirtVC. It's very, very easy to use. So if you're on 3.1.2.21, when I looked a while ago, there were at least 9 hyperfixes. And this one here, IJ31191, was pretty serious. It had to do with NPIV IO errors. And then there was another one for the Cisco MDS. There's a whole bunch more. I just wanted to give you these as an example. And then for 3.1.2.25, there was only one patch in 2020. I can tell you now that there's more like 8 or 9. So just be aware that there's a bunch of them. So this week I was doing some 3.1.3.14 updates. At the beginning of last week, there were no patches. As of right now, there's 3, potentially 4. There's one for OpenSSL, and this is after you've updated it to .700. There's one for OpenSSH, and then there's also one for LS Core. None of those 3 require a reboot. And then I found another one for the mount command. So just be aware that you really want to run the FlirtVC command after you've done your update to make sure that these go on. Some people don't like to put on Ifixes. If it's a security hole, I'm a big fan of putting them on. But I've put the CVE numbers here so that you can look at them and see if it's something that you want to put on. I have them on all my systems and my VIO servers are working just fine. And basically you can FTP to aix.software.ibm.com and go to AIX and Ifixes to download them. And the security ones are typically in a security subdirectory of either Ifixes or Ifixes. I mentioned earlier that if you're putting on an AIX update, you may need to remove the patches because they put a lock on the actual file sets. So the emanager-r-L and then the efix label is what you would use to do that. Okay. Whenever you're doing updates and patches and so on, it's important that you know how to get help. If your upgrade goes south, if you have a major problem, if it's not working right, I do all of my updates by taking a clone first. So my recovery is always reboot from the other disk. But if you do have a problem before you do that, you should know how to get a perf PMR and how to run snap. Because that's the first things IBM's going to ask you for. If it's a performance issue, they're going to ask for a perf PMR. And for any kind of technical issue, they're going to ask you for a snap. So if I think I'm going to be opening a case, I run a snap or a perf PMR and download them, go and open the case, and then I immediately upload the snap so that I save about 3 conversations with IBM support when they tell me to go take a snap. And I also make sure I have very good documentation of my VIO server, which typically I'll use the HMC scanner for, because you're going to get asked by IBM to provide a lot of information on your VIO servers. So just be aware that these are the links that you should be familiar with. VIO servers are incredibly complicated, and you can do some very, very, very cool things with them. And I'm a big fan of just because you can doesn't mean you should. You really want to keep it simple. You want to make sure that you configure all your VIO servers as consistently as possible. The LMB is your memory block size, and you want to make sure that that's the same on all your servers if you want to use LPM. Typically it defaults to 256 meg, but the way that you can check it is go to the HMC, click on the server properties, and then go to memory. And it'll either be called memory size, memory region option, or LMB. And if you want to use LPM, it has to be the same. I'm a big fan of dual VIO servers. That lets me take down one VIO while I'm updating the other, while the other one's still running everything. Another thing that I'm seeing a lot, by default, when you build your LPAR profiles, it sets the adapters up as required. You need to make sure that all of your adapters are desired, and there's 2 reasons for doing that. One is you can't replace hot plug adapters if they're required, so you want them to be desired. And the second reason is you can't boot the LPAR if the adapters are required and they're not there or there's a problem with them. So having them, and LPM will not allow you to do an LPM if your adapters are required. So I always make sure all my adapters are changed to desired. The other thing you want to make sure of is if you have VIO servers that are dual, they have to have the same VLANs on their trunk adapters. So if I have a trunk adapter that's PVID2 on VIO1 and PVI2 on VIO2, they need to have the same 8021Q VLANs on them. Otherwise, what the second VIO server you try to boot won't boot. Not mixing multipath drivers is just common sense. Running the HMC scanner and or sys plan before and after all changes. I run both. I have a history for every server I work on of every time I've made server changes, I have the before and afters. I always plan for at least 1 update a year, and 2 if possible. And I realize that there's issues getting maintenance windows, but I can tell you that if you get behind on firmware, VIO server levels, etc., what you don't want to have happen is that you've got an emergency situation where something breaks and the response you get is you need to upgrade, this was fixed in this update. So you definitely want to have a plan for doing regular updates, and you should be able to do it on your VIOs, because if you've got redundant VIOs, then you should be able to do one of them while the other one is handling the work. I run my VIO servers in pairs, and I always run at least 2. Sometimes people want to run multiple pairs they might want to isolate by country, they might want to isolate production from non-production, they might want to have one that handles all the network and one that handles all the disk I/O. That's the kind of thing that you need to plan for. And then you also want to make sure that you actually test your failover. You know, you can say that you've got your VIOs, that you've got redundant VIO, but you should test it. You should actually break the network. You know, whether you disconnect a cable or what, you need to make sure that you know that everything will work if one VIO goes down. So that's something that you need to have a test plan for. I already mentioned using Vio commands, so like I'll use update iOS or whatever. I do not use SMIDI to install software on my VIOs, but I will use eManager because there isn't an alternative. If my VIO server is on internal disk, which I always try to have it on internal disk, you need to mirror root VG. And then when you go to do updates, you can break the mirror, use that second disk for cloning, and then remirror later when you're happy. The paging issue is still around. Every VIO server I've installed for some reason has 2 page data sets on the same LUN. And they typically range from a 512 meg HD6 and a 1.5 gig paging 00. Sometimes I've seen 2 1 gig ones. I always get rid of paging 00 and make HD6 4 gig. You do not want to have 2 pages. Firstly, you don't want your VIO server to page. But if it does page, you do not want it paging to 2 page spaces on the same disk. And you certainly don't want them to be a different size. I also add logging, and I set up my dump devices properly. But your VIO server pretty much doesn't do much decent logging. So I always add logging for that. And then there's a command called part, which VIO server that periodically to get feedback. It builds a little HTML page and XML, and you can look at that and it gives you feedback on how your VIO server is behaving and whether you need to increase memory and so on and so on. And just a note, they used to tell you the minimum memory for your VIO servers was, I want to say 4 gig. The last time I created one, it wouldn't boot with less than 6. So just be aware of that. I check ERRPT regularly because I want to know if there's a problem on the VIO server. I also make sure my VIO servers do not run regularly at 100% entitlement. If you're going over entitlement, you're affecting your network performance because your SEA is scaled by entitlement, not by VPs. So just make sure that on average you are below entitlement and that you've got plenty of VPs in memory. I also back them up regularly. I use NIM, and I have scripts that just run on the 1st and the 15th of the month. No, I actually go, somebody just asked about me using ERR log under padmin. I actually go into OEM system env and I use ERRPT. But yes, you can use ERR log as padmin. So as I said, I take regular backups as well. All right. I'm one of the people that hated reading manuals and hated doing documentation. And after dealing with VIO servers, I'm now absolutely paranoid about documentation. So I use the HMC scanner tool, I use sysplan, and I save my sysplans, I print them to a PDF. I actually have a very complicated spreadsheet where I document everything, my VLANs, my virtual networks, all my WWPNs, my real ones, my SEA, everything. I take some of that from the HMC scanner report and some of it I put together ahead of time, and I use that for my installation and I just update it. I have all my equipment, my serial numbers, my customer numbers, my universal access key expiration dates for the servers. And once you get to AIX 7.3 on Power 10, you will have your universal access key expiration dates for your operating system as well. I keep track of server IO firmware levels, all the stuff that you think doesn't matter or that might matter, but you can go find it out. I keep track of it for every LPAR as well, because if the LPAR's down, I might have to answer questions on it. And then for my HMC, with the new Power HMCs, it's not just the version. There's also the BMC and PNOR, which I need to keep track of those levels, and that's stuff that I now have in my spreadsheet. So this is like a list of all the things that I can think of that I keep track of in the spreadsheet. But however, whatever you decide is important to you, make sure you have documentation and that it's not on the server, on the LPAR. So I have a script I run on my LPARs that kind of self-documents, but it actually goes to an NFS mount. Okay. So I've mentioned dual VIO servers, and there's many reasons for running dual VIO servers. One is to allow you to do concurrent updates. So you can have one VIO server handling all the network and IO while the other VIO server is being updated. It also gives you failover. So if something happens and you lose a disk, or you lose your shared Ethernet adapter, or you lose a fiber card, the other VIO server should be able to run everything. Again, you need to test that failover. On these servers like the 950 and below, you need to make sure that they have a split backplane if you're using internal disks. That way you can have 2 disks for one VIO on one backplane and 2 disks for the other VIO on the other backplane. And a lot of the times business partners and even IBMers forget about the split backplane. So it's a question you should always ask is, am I going to be able to run 2 VIO servers from internal disk? It gives you more redundancy and flexibility. And like I said before, you can also have more than one pair, depending on whether you want to split your network and disk IO or production, non-production, etc. I talked about using VIO commands. When you're doing updates, so when you're going from version 3.10, 3.10 or whatever to 3.1.3.1.4, that's an update, and you would use the update iOS command as padmin. If you're doing an upgrade, which is a version change, which right now is from version 2 to version 3, there is a VIOS upgrade command. Update iOS won't do it. Now there's 2 versions of that command. There's the VIOS upgrade that you can run as padmin, which is what I typically do, or NIM has its own version of VIOS upgrade. So you can do the VIOS upgrade from NIM. Be aware that the syntax is different between the 2. You will also need to update Java SSH and SSL. And what I do, my VIO doesn't necessarily have all the language sets in it. So I check what it's actually got installed, and then I only copy into this Java SSH SSL VIO directory the file sets that I already have installed that I want to update. Otherwise, you may only have the Java 8.SDK and the Java 8_64.SDK. So you don't necessarily want to add all the language sets. Anything you put in this directory will get installed. So just keep that in mind. And then again, as I said, the one exception is eManager for when you're doing hyperpatches. And IO firmware updates are done using diag. So you will need to also do those as OEM setup env.
So before we go into backup, Jackie, let's go over some of the questions. Okay.
Okay. Let me see if I think if I hit escape, I could probably see them. Are they in the chat? No. Just trying to see if I can figure out how to get to the questions. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, I guess I haven't tried, so I can't tell you exactly how. So
I got it.
You got it? Okay.
All right. So the VIOS backup from the HMC, does it include VIOS BR? So I actually do the VIOS BR backup separately because you can from there, and I'm not 100% sure if it does either. I don't understand the LSO LRO question, so we'll have to come back to you on that.
Okay.
Can you use the latest flash on the entitlement site? I think I have a slide on that later. I'm trying to remember. I don't believe you can upgrade from 225. It used to be you had to be at 226.32. And I've been taking people to I've got one I've got to do right now. They're at 226.21. I'm just going to take them to 226.65 and do the VIO server version 3 upgrade from there. But from 225, as far as I'm aware, there is no VIO upgrade. And yes, it will be recorded.
Yeah, you probably can see the ones that I answered.
I am the question about eManager to manage Ifixes for VIOS. I have never seen IBM recommend update iOS to do it, and in fact, have no idea how you would. Update iOS is used for like mini packs, service packs, and AIX patches. Ifixes are a different animal. They're in a completely different format. Upgrade path from 225.10, you'd have to get to 226. I'd go to 65, and from there you should be able to use the flash to do the update. I haven't actually put together a presentation. Oh, you've answered that one, Joe. That's good to know that the latest perf PMR collects a snap by default.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just flicking through. You cannot have a VIOS pair with a VIO at one site and a VIO at another site. VIO servers are per server. And in terms of required adapters not being able to be replaced with hot plug, the problem you have is the LPARs. I have them required and they won't give them up. So you would have to shut the LPAR down. So the question about whether there's an easy way to check if your LPARs have active paths in Ethernet. One way to check for the network that I've done a few times is just switch over my SEA to the other server. You can actually put the one that you're running on in standby. And clearly, if you lose your network connection, you immediately put it back. Unfortunately, the fiber stuff, there is a couple of settings on the VIOS LPM 0 setting on your VIO servers where you can tell it that before it does an LPM, that it needs to, when you do the validate, it will actually check all the way through. But if you have like 300 or 400 disks, it's going to take you a long time. So it's not easy. The Linux partitions using Ether channel, I've not had any problems. I have Ether channels, etc. So it may be version related. And there, I know that IBM does have some recommendations depending on what level you're at of your Linux system. There were some issues with some of the performance settings for the VIO server for Linux and IBM I very early on, but I believe those have been resolved. The VIO server advisor is part of your VIO server. It's called PART, that is the command. And the fix that I propose for paging is remove paging 00 and increase HD6 to 4 gig. VIO server disks on the SAN. My issue with that is if I have internal disk for my VIO servers and something happens to the SAN, I can bring up the VIO servers and I can debug. If I have a problem with the SAN or they're doing maintenance on the SAN and my VIO servers are booting from the SAN, I can't do a thing. So I always prefer my VIO servers on internal disk. I have a couple of cases where somebody forgot to order a split backplane, so I have one VIO server on the SAN and one on the internal. The big thing is to make sure if it's on internal that the disks are mirrored. Someone asked about things like eManager and that. When you type in OEM setup env, you become root. So there's no SU minus or anything like that. Once you're an OEM setup env, you can run commands like root. Dedicated versus shared process via VIO servers. I don't recommend one over the other. It depends what you're doing. Sysplan you'll find on the HMC. If you go to HMC and you select the server, and then go to actions. I think you go down to like show me all the actions, and somewhere way over on the right is the option to take a sys plan. I had to hunt it down. Okay, thanks, Dave. I'm going to look up that update iOS for installing Ifixes and hypers, and then I'll update my next time I do the presentation. The entitlement issue is specific actually to all servers, because if you're using a shared Ethernet adapter, you can affect your network performance. I mean, you don't want any LPAR running consistently over entitlement anyway. You know, the purpose of entitlement in VPs is to deal with spikes. It's not to deal with running an LPAR with insufficient resources. And one of the things I see a lot, which really makes me nervous, is if I sum the entitlements that people have on a server sometimes, it's the total number of CPUs. You want to make sure that you have enough cores free that your LPARs can grow and shrink. I can't share the spreadsheet because it's every copy of it has customer information. The script, yeah, I can probably share that. I have to go hunt it down. And what else do we have here?
Make sure you give yourself enough time to get through the rest of the presentation, Jackie.
I'll probably have to come back to some of these.
Yeah.
So, and some of them are repeated. So somebody asked me about updating the Java stuff using install P versus update iOS. No, it's not going to cause you a problem, but you really shouldn't do it. It's, you know, right. We go back, close presentation.
Okay.
All right. So we talked about using Vio server commands, and then we were going into backups. So I always, if I have internal disks, or even if I'm on the SAN, I always make sure my VIO server has 2 disks. And if I'm doing upgrades, I'll break the mirror, and then I will take an alt disk copy to another disk. Now, depending on what your philosophy is, you can use NIM to do an alt disk upgrade. You can do an upgrade in place, but have your clone to fail back to it. It really depends on what you like, how you like to do your updates. So what I like about the alternate copy, however you do it, whether it's with NIM or whether it's by doing an alt disk copy, is that if you have a problem after the upgrade, you can always change your boot list to point to the alternate disk that you saved everything on and reboot from it. So you have an instant failback. But that is not a backup. That's just a copy that you can use during maintenance. Now, I get asked all the time about, can I back up my VIO server to a USB stick, and can I restore from a USB stick? And the answer is no. I have no idea why not, because I can back up and restore AIX that way, but they don't support VIO server. Go figure. These are the, as of last week, supported methods that IBM has for backups of your VIO servers. And of course, there's one more which isn't on here, which is the actual new one on the HMC as of 9.5, which allows you to back up to and from the HMC. So I can take a version of backup iOS that goes to tape or DVD, or I can create a NIM resources tar image, or I can take a makesysb to a remote file system, i.e. my NIM server. And then the new one, which we'll talk about, is the one where I can back up to the HMC directly. I just have a backup script in cron that literally backs up my VIO servers on the 1st and 15th. Pick what dates work for you. And it basically mounts the backup directory. It creates a directory if it's not there. I always unmount the repository. This is where I put files for FBO, file backed optical, because I found that even though I'm saying no media lib, and that sometimes my backups would end up being like 80, 90 gig, even though I told it not to back it up. So I unmount it now, and then I mount it again at the end. And I take the two backups. I take the one where it creates my nym resources tar file, that's the first one. And then the second one is a pure MaxSB one that I take to the nym server as well. And that way I have the option of restoring from my HMC using the nym resources tar image, or restoring from a MaxSB. I like to cover my bets. It takes like 10 minutes longer. Obviously, this depends on an NFS mount from my nym or NFS server to the VIO. And, you know, anytime you're dealing with NFS mounts, you should never set them up to mount automatically at boot, because if the nym or NFS server is down, then you have to wait for all the timeouts. So, like I said, and then there's the link here to get the HMC scanner reports. So my backups consist of these plus my HMC scanner reports. And from those, I can pretty much rebuild whatever I have to rebuild. I have my system set up to automatically run VIO SBRs. If you run the command here, the VIO SBR frequency daily num file 7, it automatically puts an entry, and you can see it down the very bottom in cron tab, and every day it will run a new VIO SBR command and save the output, and that output, it'll keep the last 7 copies. So I know I've always got a good VIO SBR, and then you can see here the cron tab entries to run my backups for the VIO servers. So I know that because the VIO SBR output goes into /home/padmin/config backups, I know I've always got the latest VIO SBR in my MaxSB as well. And that way I don't have to think about running VIO SBRs. Oh, that's weird. It says here view next slide, but it's not there. Okay, so with HMC 9.5, there's a really nice blog by Manjunath Shambhag. Hopefully I pronounced that right. And it talks about the new functions in the HMC 9.5, which of course are in version 10 as well. And it can do a VIO, you can do a VIO server config backup there. You can do a VIO server backup. But just remember, you don't have that much space on your HMC. I think you have about 15 gig. It might not be, it might be a little more than that. So you can fill up that backup space pretty quickly. So just be aware of that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is the new HMC, which I've just been updating all my HMCs to version 10, does not support any flavor of Power 7 or 7 Plus. It only supports Power 8 and higher. Another thing that I noted with the Power version 10 update, which is very, very frustrating, is you go to version 10, then you go to 10.11, and then you put on the latest patch, which fixes the log4j security hole. For each one of those, it came up with a system event that then opened a PMR with IBM for a bug that has been around since HMC version 7 and has still not been fixed. So what you're going to want to do after you do your HMC updates is check the system events from the HMC and close them, but then you'll also have to go to the IBM website and check there for the cases that have opened. And I'm trying to remember if I have in here the actual code that it gives, but it's a well-known one. All right. So talking about resources, the most important system in the most important system LPAs in your system, yes, they should be your production ones, but they're your VIO servers, because your production systems aren't going to be able to run if their VIO servers aren't doing well. So you need to make sure that your VIO server has the highest weight, so that it can, if you're running in the shared pool, then sometimes I'll actually put my VIO servers in their own pool, and then making sure that it gets plenty of entitlement. When people size the servers, make sure they don't just sum up all your production and development LPAs, that they actually add resources for your VIO servers, because people forget that. I tend to tune my virtual buffers and my HBA settings, and I monitor them with nmon and part. whatever tool you like to use. So this is an example where I would tune my fiber adapters. So by default, your network is not set up correctly. So I always set my TCP and UDP send and receive and my RFC 1323. I do that on every AIX system. And I tend to tune my memory to make sure that my min-free and max-free have enough of a gap between them. If I run ifconfig -a and I notice that the IP, that the adapter that the IP is on has a different TCP receive or send, I'll run these commands. I've got them commented out here because I'd done them ahead of time. And then down the bottom here is where I'm tuning my fiber adapters to make sure that they have a large enough queue for all of the commands that would come through. And you can go to 4096, but it depends for the num command elms. It depends on what your storage subsystem will support. And num command elms is basically queue depth for the fiber adapter port. So it's the number of in-flight IOs or IOs that can be outstanding on that fiber adapter port. Now, these buffers are basically, if you look at a network card, it actually has built-in buffers for handling traffic coming in and traffic coming out. Also, your virtual adapters have virtual buffers that are set pretty small, and there's a whole presentation on this, but basically they're typically not large enough. So you're going to want to increase them. Now, the new default with IBM is that they've changed this buff mode such that the minimum and maximum for these buffer settings is the same. And the problem with that is then you don't know if you're running out of buffers. So I always change the minimum and the max. I change it to this buff mode min, so that my minimum set to whatever and my maximum I update. That lets me know when I look at the output of a netstat whether or not I have a problem, and then I can tweak the buffers. If once you get to the maximum setting for any of these buffers, there's nowhere for you to go. You basically either need to add more virtual Ethernets or come up with some other solution. So this is something I do. You don't have to do it. You'll know if you're getting it when you see hypervisor receive errors in your netstat output. I already talked about the Hba tuning, so I'm not going to go into this. And this is just talking about that max transfer size. The default is the 0x1 with a bunch of zeros. Actually, as of more recent levels of the operating system, even though it says that that's what it's set to, it basically is using the 0x2. What does that mean? It means you get a 128 meg DMA for doing direct I/O. And you cannot set a client LPAR higher than whatever the settings you use for max transfer size and num command elms are set to on your VIOs. And the VIOs need to be rebooted with that before you change your clients, or the clients will not boot. All right. So because we live in the world of LPM, it's important for us to understand about storage zoning and mapping. And people get them confused. Zoning is when you go to the switch and you tell the switch the WWNs or WWPNs of the LPAR adapters or the VIO adapters and the storage subsystem, so that the switch knows that they're allowed to communicate with each other on that port. Mapping or masking is when I go to the storage subsystem and I go to the LUNs that are provisioned and I tell them the specific WWPNs or WWNs that can talk to them. And for terminology, I use WWN for the real adapter and WWPN for the NPIV adapter. Some people use WWPN for everything. Either way, the real adapters will normally start with a 10 or a 20, and the WWPNs used for NPIV start with a C0. And if you run HMC Scanner, it'll get you all of the WWPNs you have to find. These are the ones where you go into the LPAR profile and you build virtual adapters. That's where you'll find them. With that said, there is one other way. If you are installing an LPAR that needs disk provisioned and it's got real adapters, what you're not going to get the WWNs that start with a 10 or a 20 from the HMC scanner. You will get them if you run a sys plan. So that's where sys plan is very useful. And the other thing you need to make sure of is that the VIO connection to the switch is NPIV enabled. So on the VIO as PAdmin, you'll run LSN ports, and you should see each of the fiber adapter ports that you think are connected, their actual connections, and you should see like stuff like this to the right. If you don't see that, then you don't have a connection to the fiber port. And so you're not going to be doing any NPIV till that's resolved. I already mentioned that, zoning is different to mapping, and stuff has to be zoned at the switch to mapped at the storage. Every virtual fiber adapter has 2 WWPNs. The first is the default one used, and the second one is used by LPM. And it doesn't log in unless LPM's been used, but you have to zone and map both of them, which irritates storage people immensely because half the ports will always be inactive and they show up on the storage subsystem as degraded. But if you want to use LPM, you must zone and map them. When you do an LPM, what happens, if it's an active LPM, the active LPM on the other server will use that second WWPN. And then if you LPM it again, it goes back to the first one. So that's why it's important that they are zoned and mapped. If you don't map them at the storage and you do an LPM, you'll damage your boot image. And there's a couple of parameters that you can set on VIOS LPM 0 on all VIO LPARs that will allow you to avoid that problem. The other comment I would make on that is the first time I LPM an LPAR, I tend to do it shut down just to make sure it will LPM fine. But keep in mind that when you do an inactive LPM, it stays on that first WWPN. So the only real is to LPM. The other thing to keep in mind if you use LPM a lot is that you might want to zone all of the WWPNs to both switches. Normally we zone them specifically because, if I look here, I could zone FCS 0 and FCS 2 to switch 1 and 1 and 3 to switch 2. But the problem is when I'm doing the LPM, if I don't pick my mappings correctly, I might end up with them switched over and then nothing will boot. So it's up to you. I'm pretty careful when I do my LPMs now, but I still try to get everything zoned to both. I already talked about this, about how LPM, when you do live LPMs, it will actually flip-flop between those 2 WWPNs. But if it's inactive, it stays with whatever it used last. So if you have the 4-port 10 gig, 1 gig network cards, you can use the 10 gig cards as fiber ports as well as network ports. And so when I do an LSDev on FCS, I'll see that I have, my 4 fiber adapter ports, and then I have these 2 fiber adapter ports that are really 10 gig fiber or network. And when you run the system, you run your RPT and you'll see errors on those because they're not connected. So there is a way to disable them from being used as a fiber adapter port if you're using them, because I tend to use my 10 gig ports for my network. So if I look here, ENT0 and ENT1 are the same ports as FCS4 and FCS5. So you can actually you can basically unconfigure them so that they sit there as defined, and now you won't get error reports anymore. Now, if you want to use them as fiber ports, then obviously you don't do this. Okay. We're up to number 10, getting there. So I've already talked about having a second disk. I like to have that second disk so that I can mirror root VG if I'm on internal disk, but also so that I can take a clone whether I'm on internal disk or SAN. So I always request 2 disks, and I preferably ask for a third one because if I'm using file-backed optical, which I use a lot, then I want to I don't want to have my repository on my root VG, because that repository can get really big. So I like to keep my root VG very small and very clean. So I tend to have, most of my VIO servers have 3 disks in them. 2 for root VG and maintenance, and the third one for file-backed optical. And I already mentioned making sure that you have a split backplane if it's an internal, if you're booting off internal disks.
So Jackie, on that, there was a question on using NVMe, which I kind of threw out an answer for. I mean, if you do NVMe, you don't need the split backplane because they're all independently assignable.
Yeah, NVMe's,
but NVMe works just as fine, right?
Yeah, NVMe works just fine. In fact, it's actually designed for VIO servers for booting. So I have no problem with using NVMe for it, but I would still put 2 NVMEs in there.
Oh yeah.
One for taking the clone. Yeah. No, I've actually installed on NVMe and it works just fine. So that's pretty much what it was designed for. And then you don't have to worry about the split backplane. You're correct.
Yep.
But a lot of people aren't doing the NVMe disks because they're more expensive. So. Well,
you get a lot of storage packed into that little thing, and you don't necessarily need that much is the problem. Right.
Well, even today, I just put together a 950 for a client, and you know, they wanted to go with internal disks. They didn't want to do the NVMe thing. The smallest disk I could get was 300 gig. So they have 4 300 gig hard drives for something that I like my root VGs to be at least 100 gig. Just because, you know, I like to put a page space on them and I do logging and stuff. I don't like to have it really, really skinny. But so 300 gig is, you know, is just a lot of wasted disk, but 300 gig disks are cheap. So, but NVMe or internal disk, you know, either will work. All right. Why do you want to use NTP? It's so that the time's consistent across all your servers. If you have to do a debug on your VIO, well, firstly, your VIO servers, if they get out of sync with each other on time, that's going to cause you a problem, and it will definitely cause a problem with LPM. Secondly, if you ever have to debug a problem where you're looking at multiple LPARs and your VIO servers and your HMC, it's really nice if they all have the same time offsets. Yes, some of the LPARs might be in a different time zone, so, you know, but you want them to be consistent with time. A lot of locations run an NTP server on their Active Directory server or somewhere else in their location, so you can point to that. These are the pooled ones that are run by the atomic clocks. You can point to those, assuming that you can get outside. On your VIO server, NTP is actually, the config file is, they still have an etsy-ntp.conf, and they also have /home padmin config ntp.conf, which is the one it actually uses. So that's the one you want to edit and change however you need to change it. And then I always run NTP date before I start NTP so that it sets the date correctly. And then I will start NTP, and this is specific to on VIO server. The other thing that you'll probably need to do is go into /etc/rc.tcp/ip and search on xntpd and make sure it's uncommented, because by default, I think it's still commented out. I know it is on AIX. All right. And this is our last one, which is on updating IO firmware. So you go to Fix Central and you go to Power IO firmware, and your VIO servers typically own all the adapters. So you're going to need to know what kind of adapters you have. You know, knowing that it's a 10 gig card doesn't help. You need to know what kind of 10 gig card, and we specifically mean feature codes like EN0A, EN1S. To find that stuff, you can go to IBM's install inventory site and pull up the inventory for your server. You'll need the server type and serial number, and you'll need an IBM login, which you should have for reporting problems anyway. And then you can look at the server and find the feature codes, and then you run LSM code space -A on the LPAR, or on the VIO server, you'll need to run it as padmin. And Then under Fix Central, you can go and find out what the latest level is. And if your level is lower, then you should look to updating it. And it's particularly important with the 10 gig and the 16 and 32 gig fiber cards, because they do need to be kept current. And so this is the command I was talking about before. If you want to test failover with your VIO server, if you can go to the primary and just change the SEA to standby mode. And what you should see is that the secondary will go to primary. So here I'm updating a 5899 network adapter, which is the 4-port 1 gig. And I had uploaded the adapters stuff. You use RPM to unpack it, and that puts it in /etc/microcode. And then you'll use the diag command and point it at one of the real adapters, ENT0, and it will then put the firmware on. Now, in the case of this, which is a multi-port adapter, it updated all 4. Typically with your 2-port and 4-port fiber adapters, it does the same. When you're doing a network adapter, if you've got an SEA on it, you may have to unconfigure it. And that's what this is talking about. You know, IF configuring it and so on. And you can see I'm just doing an rmdev-l, which just does the logical remove. When I run config manager later, it comes back. But I still go into TCP/IP and SMIDI TCP/IP and check that the IP is actually correct. So, all right. So that's everything I have on this. Let me minimize this so I can look at the questions again.
So let me throw out a question while you're doing that. You mentioned the server inventory site. Are you talking about ESS there, Jackie, or something else?
No. So IBM has a site called Install Inventory. Let me see if I've got it in the links here. Of course not. Let me bring it up.
You know, the minute you said that, I thought, oh, now people are going to ask me for that site. And, of course, you know, several of them did. And I'm familiar with an internal one, and I'm familiar with ESS, but I'm not sure I know what it is that you referenced.
Yeah, I'm just actually opening it, and then I'll change my share.
Okay.
Because it's just easier to show you. Stop sharing. I'm making sure I'm sharing the right thing. Okay, so IBM has this inventory services site, which is, and I can send you this link actually.
Somebody actually put it in the question, so I'm answering theirs.
Yeah, I can post it in
everybody should be able to see it now.
Yeah, so basically what you can do here is you can go to by serial number, and then you put in the model and serial number, retrieve the data, and click on show, and it will actually show
like
you.
What we used, yeah.
Yeah, so I use it all the time.
I guess I didn't realize that site was open to anybody. I guess you need, like you said, you need an IBM login, right? Which you should have, but I didn't realize it was even allowed that. So good to know. Okay, so other questions?
Yeah, I'm just trying to see. Just flicking through the questions now.
Okay, I'll go ahead and let you pick out them. So if I haven't put an A for answering the question, then people can't see them. So when you do it, maybe you have to either read the question or I'll try and find it and put it out there.
So there's a lot of things asking about the Ifixes and Ifixes. And somebody very kindly provided a link to the support pages on managing Ifix VIO server, so I need to go and look at that and make sure that I have that.
Okay, so you mentioned how about the HMC version 10 doesn't support Power 7. And so somebody asked, is there a reason to go to version 10 if you don't have Power 10? Which I'm not sure that there is, but
I don't know. I'd have to go and look at the. I honestly can't remember everything that it included. Most of my clients are getting off Power 7 anyway because Power 7's just it's so far out of support. There's no more firmware updates for it or anything. So, I mean, and the other thing that you can do is, honestly, you really want to go to the new Power HMCs. I just had a situation where I was updating an HMC and something went wrong. I think the network went out and their HMC was toast. So when the network came back, I couldn't boot the HMC, but because it was a Power HMC, I was able to connect to the BMC, even though the HMC itself was down. I was able to mount the recovery ISO image as like a virtual optical, and then reinstall my HMC from that ISO image. And because I'd taken a backup to my NIM server, I was then able to do the restore from my save upgrade data. So, which was really good because the nearest person to the data center was over 2 hours away. So I was able to completely reinstall and recover that HMC from my house using the BMC. And for me, that's one of the, apart from the fact that IBM's not going to be updating the Intel ones anymore, that to me is one of the most powerful reasons to go to the new HMC. And I'd have to go and read everything they said came out in version 10. What I've been telling people to do is, look, you know, if you're running on Intel HMCs, you know, and you've got some Power 7, bring in a Power HMC, move all your Power 8 and stuff over to that, and keep the old Power 7. You know, running the higher. I mean, if you only got Power 7s, this is a moot discussion. So, but I also like the fact that the version 10 stuff has that log4j security patch on it. So somebody was asking me about using alt-root VG copy upgrade versus update iOS. Alt-root VG, I mean, if I just use the copy to save everything, I still use update iOS to do my patches. And if I'm doing it from NIM, there's a NIM version of update iOS. We already had answered the questions on NVMe. Yeah, I can't answer the question about the Linux systems hanging because I'd have to go do a bunch of research about the versions and etc. that are supported. I would suggest you look at the Red Book and make sure that the levels that you're running are supported on the hardware and VIO server levels that you're running. We already answered those. Yeah, a lot of comments on NVMe, which I think we addressed.
Yeah, I think we talked about that though.
Internal spinning disks. So someone asked if I'd use SAN full storage snapshot. I don't get access to the SAN systems very often, so no. And then someone else asked about mirroring the VIO internal with SAN. So you're talking about having one internal disk and one SAN disk, I think. I mean, you could do it. It works. I'm not sure I'd bother, but because if I lose the SAN and I'm mirrored, and one of my disks is on the SAN and one of them's on internal, I've got to deal with the whole broken root VG problem. But you could certainly try it. I wouldn't, but you can. keeps, as every time someone adds a question, it scrolls back up on me, so I have to.
Yeah.
Someone made a comment, IBM has a config script which will pull all required data for documents. Is that a question or a, because I've never found one. Someone actually asked me the other day, they wanted to know if IBM had a command to do a full inventory of every software level that was running on their system. Yeah. The VIO daemon service issue, I've not seen that on 31314, but if you are seeing a problem like that, you should open a PMR with IBM. Someone was talking about mapping VPs to ENTC. I'm not sure what you mean.
And virtual processors to entitlement, how much entitlement they get?
Oh, the recommendation.
That's a common question, I think.
Yeah. So I've talked a lot with Nigel Griffiths about this, and also a long time ago with Grover Davidson. And the recommendation now is typically a minimum of about 0.6. But what you want to do is make sure that that you don't go over entitlement very much. You know, if you go over it for a few minutes a day, that's one thing. But if you're going over it most of the time, you need to bump your entitlement. So, you know, if my entitlement is 0.6 and I'm good with that, I still give myself 2 VPs. Very rarely have I had a VIO server that's needed more than 2 VPs, but you know, again, it's so workload specific. If you're running an E1080 with hundreds and hundreds of LPARs, you may need more. So it's very hard to give you a recommendation. I can't answer the question on SRIOV about proc usage being high, you know, whether that affects network performance. I wouldn't think so, but I don't know. Someone else asked if I set the Power 9 processor mode. I always have my processor mode set to default. So when I activate it, it comes up with whatever the HMC and the server thinks best. I've never used the virtual HMC. I don't see why you couldn't. So
it does have all the same features as the appliance. I think it's a good second HMC for a lot of people.
The problem I have with the virtual HMC, Joe, is that it can't control the server it's running on.
Absolutely, yes.
And so that is one gotcha, you know, is if you're using a virtual HMC on, you know, one of your power servers, it can only control the other servers.
The other one. So you have to have enough power servers that isn't an issue. If you've got just one or two, it just doesn't work out very well.
Yeah. So
but you can run the virtual HMC on an Intel box too. I mean, it doesn't have to run on a power server.
Yeah.
You can run a virtual HMC on an x86 system.
Yeah, I've been avoiding it for the reason that I just gave, but also the Intel one simply because typically I don't have control in the Intel space, and secondarily I don't know how long IBM's going to continue to support virtual HMC on Intel. So
yeah, I haven't seen anything about that. I mean, they do still today, and I haven't seen anything about that, but you know, can't predict the future.
There's a lot of other questions in here. There's one I wanted to address, which is the Power HMC BMC. So the BMC, and it's different between the CR1 and CR2, but in both cases, it has to have its own IP. Now, then you have a choice. You can plug it into the IPMI interface, in which case you need a second physical connection, or if you put what I call the public IP, which is the one you HTTP to the HMC on ENT0, you can set up the BMC in failover mode so that it rides on the same cable. And that's what I do, because I'm usually fighting for switch port connections and cables. So I don't connect the IPMI interface physically. I do the ride over. You could do it either way, both work. And that's about all That's about all I can answer right now, I think. Joe, you're going to send me the questions anyway that haven't been answered, right?
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, somebody actually put in here to disable call home before the upgrade. Because that was a comment for the upgrade stuff that I was having problems with. You know, and yeah, but you shouldn't have to, I'm sorry, but you shouldn't have to disable call home, you know, when you're doing an upgrade. So IBM development is working on the issue with the problems that keep getting opened, but that's a really good, Chris, thank you for that. He's put the commands in there for people to disable and enable call home. I'm going to have to add that into my documentation because I always forget. And in terms of somebody asked about changing, why am I changing default settings? Why isn't it set correctly out of the box? You know, I think one of the reasons, and it goes back a long way, and Joe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but IBM's, you know, trying to make their Unix look like Unix. And so they tend to leave it set up for the default minimum system. I have no idea why that hasn't been updated over the years. But I just look for it, and if it's not correct, I just correct it. I get too frustrated asking myself why. Yeah, that's pretty much everything. I think that's everything I can answer right now.
All right. Well, Jackie, and I'll go ahead and send these to you as well. I want to thank you so much for doing this. It's been great. I appreciate it. And I know you're have a busy start to your year, as you told me. So thank you.
Oh, no problem. I actually enjoy these. And, you know, it's like everything I've learned the hard way. And I'll be the first to tell you I don't know everything, and I'm not always 100%. But if there's something I know that can stop somebody taking an outage, I'd rather share it. So I appreciate the time.
Yeah. Okay, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And I'll be sending out invites for the February webinar, probably in a week or two, and we'll go from there. So thanks everyone, and have a good month.
Thanks, Joe.